International just had a celebration on Tuesday, yesterday, their 100th anniversary. So we've been around for a long time. We're the host club of America, and welcome tonight. We have a spectacular program. I promised I would not praise her, our membership chair, Balor, but I have to anyway. She has done a great job. And we are especially, and she will introduce our guest speakers tonight. I'm especially grateful to Global Shapers, who have really stepped up to the plate and become part of our monthly programs. And we welcome the participation of Global Shapers with the Rotary Club of New York, and hope that we together can set a precedent for other Rotary clubs around the world, and Global Shapers can have a participation and a presence with them as well. I'm certainly going to recommend that with the other clubs that I speak to. I was at several meetings with the several clubs in Great Britain yesterday. So I've spoken enough. You've heard enough from me. I don't want to take from our great list of speakers tonight. Membership Chair, Borlor Temurchador, would you please introduce our guest speakers tonight as only you can?
Thank you so much, President Gerard. Good evening, everyone, distinguished Rotarians and Global Shapers, our distinguished guest speakers and moderators. And we are humbled and honored to have seasoned lawyers with almost 60 years of experience of combined experiences tonight, and two brilliant young ladies from Global Shapers New York Hub, Viva Swat Dadawal, who's an associate in the King and Splattings New York office, practicing international arbitration law and including space law, which is very interesting, and Ying Li, leading operations at the Cambrian Biopharma, a distributed drug discovery company focused on the biology of aging and methods of extending healthy human longevity. We have two sessions tonight, and each session has 20 minutes moderated sessions with 10 minutes Q&A. And first session led by Viva, the COVID impact on deal world. And our speaker is an experienced corporate lawyer, Lorenzo Borgogni. He's practicing M&A law over the past 20 years, and he's a partner at Ackerman Law Firm. The second session will be led by Ying Li, the COVID impact on the US immigration. The speaker for this session is our very own past president of Rotary Club of New York, John Brown. John is the principal attorney of the law office of John Brown, New York City-based law firm specializing in the practice of immigration law. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. Everyone besides speakers and moderators attending this session will be muted automatically. And if you have a question, please submit on the chat box. Feel free to ask questions as we go. And this session will be recorded and shared publicly. Thank you so much. And please, Viva is here.
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Please take over, Viva. Stage is yours, and Lorenzo, take care.
Thank you, and thank you for the warm welcome. So because time is limited and we have a lot to go through, and welcome to everyone. We're going to just jump right into the first session on pandemics and deal making. As Balor mentioned, my name is Viva. And we will be talking to Lorenzo today. So Lorenzo, as you know, many places around the world are marking the 1-year anniversary of the devastating pandemic. I'm sure I'm not alone in remembering the time when US and other places around the world just came to a halt. What was it like for you in deal making, and what was it like in the mergers and acquisitions world?
Thank you, Viva. Well, so the first quarter of 2020 witnessed perhaps the biggest and most sudden disrupting event that the global M&A market has ever experienced. In March, April of 2020, pretty much every transaction that was pending, meaning that had been signed and was awaiting to close, and there was an estimated 300 transactions, significant M&A transaction pending worth $500 billion. Was it going to fall apart? be renegotiated, at best significantly be delayed. As it turns out, virtually all transactions were delayed, but and some did fall apart. But by and large, most transactions eventually did get done, and they got done on pretty much the terms the terms that the parties had originally stipulated. So a good outcome after a really horrifying beginning of the year.
And sorry, I
was personally involved in several M&A transactions in March and April that were put on hold and were resumed around September, October of 2020. And then everybody sort of rushed to close their deals before the end of the year, because the expectation is that the new administration, the Biden administration, is going to change tax laws, especially capital gain taxes. And so there was a rush to close deals before the end of the year.
And now you mentioned that some of the transactions were delayed. Some of the transactions were being renegotiated. What were the repercussions to these kind of unforeseeable events? And what was it like? What was the response like on the ground legally as a result of COVID? Did the deal terms change at all? As you
I think what happened is that the initial reaction of buyers with respect to their pending transaction was either try to get out of their deals or to renegotiate the terms of the deal. So to accomplish that, they initiated litigation, preemptive litigation against sellers, or were sued by the sellers to be held to the original terms of the deal. So for non-business lawyers, the concept of force majeure, I think, is well known. When circumstances surrounding a business transaction change so dramatically that the parties are essentially released from their obligations under what would otherwise be unenforceable contracts. In the deal world, the concept of force majeure is translated into the so-called material adverse change or material adverse effect clause. And essentially, you don't close the deal if the target suffers a major disruption affecting the target's business. And so the litigation was mostly focused on this particular clause, but it wasn't super successful because MAE clauses have several carve-outs. And events like pandemics, even though they may not be specifically mentioned as a carve out to the MAE clause, are generally interpreted to be subsumed under, like, for example, general events affected the economy of the industry in which the target is operating. And so, like, those transactions, those litigations were mostly used to gain negotiating leverage by buyers to reduce the price. I was personally involved in one of those, not representing the principals, but representing a hedge fund that was essentially doing arbitrage trading on the stock of the target. And that is the acquisition of Tiffany by LVMH, which is a $16 billion transaction. And I think the interesting component of that transaction is that LVMH conveniently found a letter from the Foreign Ministry of France saying that, suggesting that they delay the closing of the transaction because they were dealing with the threat of trade tariffs by the Trump administration. And the delay was passed to drop that day under the purchase agreement, which would have allowed LVMH to essentially terminate the merger agreement and be done with it. And, so they, of course, Tiffany sued them. And at the end of the transaction, the price was renegotiated, but in a minimum amount, given the size of the transaction, only like about $400 million, which for LVMH, it was a kind of a rounding error. So this wasn't a very effective way to get out of the deal. So lawyers got creative. And another challenge to the M&A transactions pending was to argue that as the seller was trying to cope with the pandemics and deal with it, they would be in breach of the so-called interim operating covenants. which essentially obligate the seller to operate their business in the ordinary course, pending the closing of the transaction. So those challenges were successful, and back in December, the Delaware Chancery Court, which is the most important court dealing with business litigation, did rescind a transaction, a large transaction of $5 or $6 billion on those grounds. So that is for litigation. And by the way, going forward, I think you can pretty much assume that M&A clauses will specifically reference pandemics and COVID-19 as a carve out. So that won't be anymore like a ground for challenging a transaction unless, it disproportionately affects the target. There's a carve out to the carve out. And also the interim operating covenants, now like the practice is to essentially stipulate that if you had to take action to deal with pandemics and COVID-19, that's deemed to be operating business in the ordinary course. So the buyer can't use that as an argument to get out of the deal. So that's that's in the nutshell, the sort of litigation scenario. Yeah.
And what about outside of litigation and outside of dispute resolution? Can you talk a little bit more about how the trust has been restored between parties who are entering into these mergers and acquisitions? What is it like outside of the adversarial system?
Yeah. So I think when you do an acquisition, a significant component of it is to do due diligence on the target, right? That includes lawyers reading a bunch of documents for which you don't need to access the facilities. But the business people, they do want to go and tour the facility. They want to see, with their own eyes what they're buying, right? Because those are large transactions, et cetera. And that has been challenging to do, right? Especially during COVID, when during the lockdown where maybe plants, facilities, offices were closed, or if they were open, they had very limited access, so people had to be creative. I've heard of instances where people have been using drones to do their surveys and inspections of the facilities. I think one of the consequences of this was obviously the deals got delayed. I think that for the rule that you'd have to plan in advance to do your diligence because it would take more time. And things have gotten a lot better from a diligence standpoint, but it's still challenging, right? Especially like, for example, now I'm just getting involved in a transaction that has a US component as well as a European component. And I represent a European buyer, and the US part of the business is significant, and they're asking me like, we want to do due diligence, but they can't travel to the US because the borders are still shut down. So how do you do that? And again, you use common sense, and you say you either hire somebody locally that can go there and do it for you, or you can have somebody there like with a video camera, like an iPhone, giving you a virtual tour of the facilities. I mean, you get creative, right? A subset of the diligence issue that we have, the lawyers have to deal with, is the PPP program. Those are loans that the government made available to businesses to stay in business, to pay their operating expenses due to the pandemic. And that is debt, right? But it's forgivable debt. So when you were entering into a transaction and you didn't know at the time you were entering a transaction whether the PPP requirements have been complied with, and therefore whether the loan was going to be forgiven. Because if it wasn't forgiven, that it was debt that should be deducted from the purchase price you were paying. If it was forgiven, then who cares? Nobody cares, right? So you would escrow that amount and keep it in escrow and waiting until a decision was made as to whether to forgive the loan or demand repayment. And then once that decision had been made, the escrow would be released to the seller or the buyer depending on the outcome of that transaction. The third one that I would like to mention is earnouts. The earnouts have always been around, but I think they've come back sort of with a vengeance post-pandemic because buyers were uncertain about the business prospects of the businesses we're buying, and sellers also didn't want to leave too much money on the table because they were hopeful that things would resume and business would go back to normal. And so the way you bridge that gap, there's a closing purchase price that you pay, And then there's additional consideration that is contingent based on the business achieving certain targets that over the next the 1 to 3 years after closing. So we've seen a resurgence of that as a result of the pandemic.
Thanks.
I think that's
Yeah.
I think
that gives everyone a crash course on the law. But how do you feel about, or I guess, what are your thoughts on present day recovery? What's the current state of the market? Are you seeing things? They weren't already as bad as expected, but where are we now?
Yeah, so I would say that the M&A market has pretty much adapted to the new environment and recovered from it. In fact, I would go further and say that as shocking as the impact of COVID was on the economy, so was the surprising has been the speed at which the market has recovered. And this was made possible by massive intervention by Federal Reserve in the US and certain banks outside of the United States, governments in the US with the CARES Act. We talked about the PPP program, as well as the checks that were given to people generally, and enhanced employment benefits, which allowed for consumer demand, so employment to sort of remain. Not complete. It was massively affected, but it didn't everything didn't go to hell, right? We maintained it as some semblance of normalcy, and consumer spending, was sustained thanks to those things. That allowed, the financing to continue to be available to do cash deals, and the stock market, has kept up, except took a dive in the beginning, but sort of has done really well. So that allowed for stock deals to be done. And then on top of that, the result of the election, the added stability, and the vaccine, the result of the vaccine added stability. And stability and predictability are key ingredients to the deal-making environment. So on that basis, people sort of got comfortable, and they realized that in most sectors, right, they could continue to do M&A transactions. And in fact, if you now look back at 2020, although sort of the global M&A market took a dip compared to 2019, it was in the single digits. And in the US a little bit more pronounced, but still pretty decent. And what we saw is that after the first quarter, the market essentially froze. Nothing happened for a good 3 or 4 months. But then after July, people sort of got used to the environment and started doing deals. And if you could annualize the rate of M&A transactions in the second half, it would have been a massively record year, because they were all jammed into the second half of 2020. So I think the M&A market is pretty healthy right now, and I've experienced it myself. I've been very busy. My firm overall is, very busy in the M&A. So it's very active in that market. Obviously, there are winners and losers. For example, the high growth market, tech and, financial services and healthcare have done well through the pandemic. Other sectors like the energy, with perhaps the exception of renewables, hospitality, live entertainment, they've been hit very hard. And so on the one hand, you've seen, the M&A working out in the end, but, there's also been a very significant number of bankruptcies in the department stores, restaurant chains, rental car companies, airline companies, the entertainment, the fitness world. They've been hit, very, very hard. So it depends on, there've been winners and losers. But I think overall, sort of the M&A market has held up pretty well, I would say.
Thank you. I'm being mindful of the time. I do have a question, so I will skip that question. I will hopefully we will address it in the Q&A. But just to round things off, we've discussed the impact of COVID on the deal world. We've discussed various legal responses to the pandemic. Before we kind of just conclude on the session and move to questions and answers, If you had to take a quick peek in your crystal ball, which you obviously have, can you tell us what we should be expecting in 2021? Are we going to see more drones going and doing due diligence? What are your thoughts on 2021?
I mean, I personally have a pretty thick pipeline. I was very busy from November through just a couple weeks ago, and I'm taking a breather now. But I expect a really busy 2021, and I'm not the only one. I think the expectation that it'll be very active M&A market. In the legal world, law firms are hiring left and right, because they think that they're going to need a lot of bodies to work on M&A deals. And the numbers that we hear, are sort of staggering. There will be, because there will be M&A from the sort of winners, people who have companies that have benefited from the pandemic that will acquire, weaker companies. But even people who have been affected negatively by the pandemic and has survived it, they'll have to figure out what to do. Maybe diversify, do an acquisition, so that they're not as exposed to this as they were in 2020. And even companies that have done well due to the pandemic. I'm thinking about toy manufacturers, right? Because families were confined in their houses, and so they bought a lot of toys, board games. It was play night, every night, etc. So the toy companies have done really well, and they weren't doing very well before the pandemic. And now they're thinking, as the pandemic subsides, whether they will continue to ride this wave, or whether they'll have to do something, to sustain their businesses. I hear that there is in private equity, they will raise a record amount of funds, and private equity fuels M&A. So that will be another driver for 2021. And all these bankruptcies, I'm sure that will generate also like distressed M&A, because there will be buyers, looking at to snatch up some of those bankrupt or reorganizing companies, for pennies on the dollar. So I think overall, I think the drivers are there for a really active M&A market in 2021.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think with that, we already have some questions. I have one saved specifically. I will hold off on my question just because we already have two here. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to just type them up in the chat box. That'd be very helpful. I'll start with the first question. Where are the litigants from all these different countries? So you described, pending litigations happening because of the mergers and acquisitions deals. Where are they going? Where are these disputes being resolved?
I don't know, and I generally read literature about this. I'm not personally a litigator. I'm a transactional lawyer. I was involved in that Tiffany's litigation because, again, I represent a hedge fund, and they were, they were doing arbitrage trading, meaning like try to make money trading on the expectation of whether the deal would fall apart, go forward on the original terms, or be renegotiated. I don't know that there's a lot of litigation at this point on this. You should the pandemic has run its course, right? Because this only matters during the pendency of the transaction. So for larger deals, Tiffany, for example, had been signed a long time ago, and they had antitrust issues, and so the closing didn't happen, for, I don't know, maybe more than 6 months. But most transactions, the closing follows after signing, only a few months after signing, right? So you had this window where you litigated, and those litigation mostly have been settled, like renegotiated. In some cases, the deal did fall apart. But I don't know that there's a lot of pending litigation in the M&A right now.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely, and who knows, maybe we'll see more of it spill out in 2021 as companies kind of figure out their options. I also have one question from Thomas McConnon, who talks about a number of very small companies. So he mentions 400,000 very small companies that have just disappeared in the US. Can you please discuss, comment on kind of just these small companies just basically vanishing, but also PPP, which I think only applies to, sorry, same several million, less than 20 employees. So I think probably PPP has some requirements for companies to be eligible, I assume. Can you just talk about, suppose these 400 or very small companies, how their experience has been?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, if you, like, I live in New York, right? And so we know that a lot of business have gone belly up. You know, some of which I really liked, you know, and so some, you know, the Pan Quotidien is gone, for example. Dean and DeLuca is gone. Maison Kaiser is gone, right? Those are, like, you know, they were everywhere in Manhattan. You would just walk around and you'd see them, and then they have disappeared. So that's not what I deal with. So that's not what I personally deal with. But it's unfortunate. I mean, that is one of these horrifying consequences of this pandemic. I don't know how, if and when these businesses will come back. I wish, I hope they will. Some people just decide not to take advantage of PPP. I'm not sure exactly why. For example, Kaiser, I read that they just decided to just shut down. Like, they didn't want to deal with this, right? And I don't know exactly why. But the PPP has worked in my experience, and I also see a lot of smaller deals in which I don't represent the principals, but I actually represent insurance company that provide rep and warranty insurance. So I see a lot of those deals, and pretty much almost every seller in this transaction took advantage of the PPP. So based on my experience, PPP has been a very successful program. I told you about that diligence issue, which is, lawyers have learned to deal with. And so now it's sort of an easy thing to address. In the beginning, like, people didn't know how to handle it, but now it's like, a practice had developed to deal with it. But I would say that the PPP has been instrumental sort of to keep the economy going. Unfortunately, it wasn't, for a bunch of businesses, that wasn't sufficient. And I know that, I don't know what the number, but I think a third of, like, restaurants, for example, in New York are gone. Like, they'll never come back, which is really sad, so yeah.
That is very unfortunate. I have one question, seeing no others from the audience, which I've been waiting to ask. It involves the younger generation, who is always interested in startups. Can you talk a little bit about how startups have done during this pandemic? And yeah.
So interesting. I mean, that's not really the focus of my practice, but I think startups suffered pretty significantly initially. That startups, unlike more established companies, are more vulnerable to economic shocks because they typically engage in higher risk activities because they have higher constraints in accessing traditional financing, both because they have a limited track record. They have little or no assets. Most of them, they have prospects of becoming a profitable company, but they're not profitable. In terms of their relationship with suppliers and customers, at best, those are formative relationships. And then they sort of rely on a core group of people, which includes the founders, just a skeleton of people. So, like, all of those, make them very vulnerable to things like pandemics. And I think in the beginning, people were bracing for an onslaught in the startup sector because of the lack of financing. Basically sort of a capital crunch, right? No consumer demand, VC funds not investing. Like everybody was sort of sitting on their cash, right, waiting to see what would happen. And in terms of like exit, who knows when this thing is going to go away? So like the exit timelines would get extended, both for venture capital investors and founders. And also COVID put a damper on new startups being launched. So that was the beginning. But much like the M&A market, then if you look back and you now look at the numbers, in this sector for 2020, the numbers are that VC invested more in 2020 than they did both in 19 and 18, like significantly more, like 160 billion versus 140 billion. Like the seed part of that, which is like, the money that goes to the real startup, like, the one that starts from scratch, was comparable in 2020 as it was in 2018, 2019. And listen to this, like normally when you are in a recession, like new business started tend to slow down, decrease. And instead it was a massive increase in 2020. 25% more business were started in 2020 than in 2019. So like, this is not my area, but I think overall, I'm sure there's losers and winners, but overall the numbers are pretty good. Again, like a really hard first 6 months of the year, but then I think things got fixed in the second half of the year, even in the startup world.
Thank you, Lorenzo. This has
You're
been
welcome.
very, very interesting, very informative. The future seems bright, at least for the
Yes.
economy and the market. I would like to now hand it over to Yingli. Again, it was a pleasure talking to you today. And Yingli, please take it away.
Hey, hi everyone. So thank you, Viva, and also Lorenzo for that really informative talk. We're going to move the session now to more about COVID's impact on immigration in the US. So before I get started, I'm going to do a quick intro to our speakers. So Jan, are you there?
I am here. I am ready.
Perfect. Okay, so Jan is a very tenured and experienced immigration lawyer with more than 35 years of experience practicing in this space. So along with being the principal lawyer of his practice, he also is the current co-chair of the New York State Bar Association's International Section Immigration and Nationality Committee. Along with those responsibilities on the side, he has been and currently is a contributing editor and author to several law publications and also blogs for the Huffington Post on the side on various immigration topics. He also is a frequent lecturer on diverse immigration related topics at the American Immigration Lawyer Association, the New York State Bar Association, and other groups. And most importantly, I think, is that he was one of the past presidents of the Rotary Club of New York. So Jan, thank you for speaking with us today. So before I get into the questions, I just want to set some context. COVID has definitely upended the way we work and even where we work. So we thought we would focus this conversation about working visas and the impact on, foreign employees and employers, obviously related to immigration. So I'm just going to get started and say, so Jen, how do you think, or what have you seen in your practice is how COVID has affected U.S. immigration policy, overall, and also in particular working visas?
Okay, well, thank you, Ying, for that very nice introduction. Gee, I must be so busy. I'm surprised I even have time to show up tonight. Anyway, well, for business immigration in particular, there's two different aspects. There's the overseas or consular processing, and there's the domestic application. So starting first with overseas, under the Trump administration, a travel ban was implemented early on after COVID hit. Embassies closed or had limited hours ultimately, because the Trump administration was basically an anti-immigrant across the board administration. They used COVID to stall cases, deny cases, and then with the travel ban, um, even if someone was given a visa, they might not be able to come to the country because they needed what was called a national interest exemption from the travel ban. In order to get that, they had to show humanitarian or national security reasons why that should be lifted. As a result, and this travel ban covered basically Europe, the Schengen area, the UK, Brazil, and then South Africa was added. So people were scrambling and had to go to different countries, stay there for at least 14 days, have a visa appointment, and do an end run around it. So it's very disruptive of people's lives, and many people still are stranded. Now, if this were a TV show, right now the crawler would say breaking news, and the breaking news is about an hour ago, President Biden signed a proclamation canceling the travel ban. So there is no more travel ban. So I've just given you old news and new news. The new news is good news. I'm very happy to report that. Ta-da. So anyway, getting back to your question, which basically is how was things under the Trump administration, inside the United States, in many ways, there were certain benefits. For one, first, of course, all appointments stopped right away while everybody figured out what to do. But USCIS did keep functioning, although more slowly, doing paperwork because people were working remotely within USCIS, and it took them a long time to figure out how to do it, as did many people, perhaps. And now, when there are appointments where people have to actually come in for the appointments at federal buildings, they go much more quickly because USCIS can't have the large waiting rooms stuffed with people like they used to do. So it's, in a way, it forced a reform so that if somebody is supposed to be there at 9 o'clock, they'll probably be called in by no later than about 10 o'clock on the average, as opposed to in the past, a 9 o'clock appointment could be called at 11:30 if they were lucky half the time. So they're very cognizant of that. I had 2 hearings at immigration today I went to, and each time everybody's temperature is taken and there's, the chairs are all apart. So they're very cognizant of that. Another benefit for lawyers is lawyers are allowed to appear by telephone at interviews. Why did I risk my life and go to these interviews? Well, I wore 2 masks, so I was comfortable. But beyond that, sometimes I find it's more important to, if it's a complicated case, to actually be there to like stick my tongue out at the interviewer and say, idiot. But that doesn't work anymore because I was wearing a mask. But I do what I have to do to win those cases. So another good thing is that because of COVID, USCIS across the board gave a 60-day extension people to put in documentation or to answer requests for additional evidence, because they did understand that it could be difficult to get documentation if offices are closed, and it could be clunky if people are sick, and it could be clunky if people are working remotely and have to figure it out. So I would say on the home front, it worked out a bit better than it did on the international scene. But as I said, breaking news, that's now history, and hopefully things will start to get better for people who are marooned overseas.
Yeah, you sound like a good lawyer. Your clients are lucky to have you. I actually want to follow up with what you just said, because you're sort of setting up this context that there was already a lot of change to immigration policy prior to COVID, and then COVID introduced a whole other bunch of changes, and those sound like those policies almost superseded in some places other things that are already in place. So would you be able to give an example of maybe a client who sort of got caught in the crosshairs of all these changes, and how did you help them navigate through that? Yeah.
Well, I have a client who's a sports coach, and he was in Italy. And so he was originally scheduled for his interview in Milan, but Milan was closed. So we got him an appointment in Rome. And then with the travel ban, they refused to approve his visa, which they were doing to just keep people there. So then he went to Brazil, where he also has citizenship, and then they put Brazil on the list as well. So he's stuck there. So he's now on his way to Chile, where we set up a visa appointment for him. So he took his whole family and he went to Chile, where he will have to stay for at least 14 days, have a COVID test, then be interviewed, and then he can come to the United States without having to worry about the national interest exception. We, of course, not knowing that now that has been canceled, because breaking news, it just happened an hour ago. So that's like one example of the changes that people have had to make to try to get around this. And of course, the employer back in the United States is going crazy, because he's worried that now, as soon as the weather gets warm, he'll need this coach to help him with his business, and he's worried that it's so uncertain. But now that we're sending him to Chile, it'll work out. So that's one example of what has gone wrong.
Okay, well, I have to hand it to your client for doing all that he possibly can to make his career work. So actually, on that breaking news front, how do you anticipate any major changes to the policy now that we have a new administration in, but also the fact that the pandemic has gone a lot longer than we initially anticipated?
Well, yes, I'm very optimistic that things will get a lot better. The first proclamation that President Trump signed was called Baja. Baja. Now, what is Baja? That's Buy American, Hire American. So what Baja was a policy that basically said, don't let immigrants into the country, because immigrants are taking away jobs from Americans. The first proclamation that President Biden signed on the day he was inaugurated was to revoke Baja. So we say ta-ta to Baja. And the attitude of the Biden administration is that immigrants don't hurt the job market. They're part of the whole mix of building a strong economy. And it's not a hire American policy, it's create jobs policy. And they have a more enlightened approach to the fact that immigrants bring skills to the country. Immigrants make the country more economically competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Another thing that the Biden administration did immediately was propose a major new law. It's 250 pages long, that among other things, and for business immigration in particular, was designed to clear up backlogs, because in many cases, even for like investor visas, H-1 visas to green cards, certain countries have enormous waits. For example, in India, right now, to get a green card on the basis of having been sponsored, it could easily take 15 years or so. And this policy has basically, in my opinion, helped India create the offshore computer industry that it does have, because a lot of Indians have come here, they've gotten trained here, and then they might have had an H-1, or they might not have been able to get an H-1, which is a non-immigrant work visa, and so they were pushed out of the country. So one of the problems we've had is we've been basically training the international competition to our detriment. So this law, I think, will go a long way to solving that. Another thing is in there is a path to citizenship for the dreamers, the people who have DACA, and some of you look a lot younger than me, and some of you might actually be dreamers, or we can all dream. So I'm optimistic that things are going to get a lot better, and the bureaucracy itself has a new leader, a new president, and we have a new head of the State Department. We have a new head of Homeland Security, and these people are not anti-immigrants. So the feeling of be nice, or don't be as restrictive as the Trump administration in trying to say no to people who want to come legitimately to the country to work and to live, is such that I'm very optimistic that more people will get through the system because they're qualified and the adjudicators aren't looking to cut them off.
Okay. So there's light at the end of the tunnel for us, anyone trying to work in the US. But what would you say would be some general advice you would give to either prospective employees looking to move to the United States or employers looking to bring in foreign talent at this time?
Well, I would say that you definitely need to have an immigration attorney. It's not a simple system. It's still very complex. There's a competition in the United States for the crown of most complicated body of laws, and it's always a close race between the U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act and the Internal Revenue Tax Code, for which is the most convoluted, contradictory, and complicated body of laws. And that being said, I mean, if someone has a job here and someone is able to be sponsored, they should. And if an employer has reached out and found a foreign worker who they want, it certainly is doable. And as I said, I'm much more optimistic that we'll be able to get cases through without the pain and the heartache we've had to do before. I mean, the Trump administration has turned a lot of immigration attorneys, including myself, into pretty crackerjack federal court litigators, because we were always running to federal court because the words arbitrary and capricious just were everywhere. I mean, we were dealing with people who came up with ways to say no that were, if you want to call it fake news. It wasn't in the law, it wasn't in the regulations, and they did it anyway. And so, either these laws were actually struck down, trying to change the laws and the regulations were often struck down during the Trump administration, but in a lot of cases, we just had to do it on a case-by-case basis. And if you think about it, in terms of the strategy of keeping people out of the country, it makes it more expensive, it makes it more frustrating. A certain number of people would give up because it's very expensive to have to litigate like crazy. So even if the Trump administration lost they won if they kept down immigration. So I had one interesting fact, which was in the last quarter of 2019, 15% of all the H-1B visas, which is a professional non-immigrant work visa, were denied. Then there was a lot of litigation, striking down a lot of regulations that the Trump administration put through. And a lot of lawyers started aggressively going to federal court, where the judges basically follow the law and not the politics. So the rate of denial went down to 1.5%. So that's pretty dramatic. So because there's a lot of pushback. So we've had to become very aggressive to defend the rights of people to get the benefits that they're legally entitled to. So, now that we're all aggressive fighters, watch out, Biden administration. You better be nice to us.
All right. Well, I want to be cognizant of time, but thank you so much for your deep dive, especially on the impact of the current pandemic and political climate on working visas. But now switching over to questions from the audience, which I think actually touched maybe more broadly on the topic of immigration. So the first one being, Jen, can you rank the US in terms of restrictions with policies, like immigration policies, compared to other countries?
Well, I would say we're better than North Korea, where they shoot you if you try to come in. But I really don't know. I mean, the other end of the spectrum from North Korea would be countries where you can buy your way into the country. There's lots of countries around the world where if you pay a certain amount of money, you can become a citizen ultimately. The United States, it happens to be one of those countries where we have investor visas where people could put in $900,000 or $1,900,000, depending on the circumstances in an enterprise. They ultimately can get residence and then citizenship. But compared to other programs, we have lots of restrictions. The money has to be invested at risk. There are quota delays, certainly from China. It's about a 6-year wait now. Other countries, if you want to become a citizen of a Caribbean island, you just give them money and they'll give you a passport. So I became an expert in that when the Soviet Union was falling, and lots of Russians with money were coming to me, and so I learned all about different countries where they could become citizens. So to answer the question, we're not North Korea and we're not the Cayman Islands, so we're somewhere in the middle.
Okay, great. And just so everyone's aware, that question came from Thomas McConan. Our next question is from Olaf, I think. And the question is, now that the travel ban has been lifted, are we allowed to travel back to Germany? I believe Olaf holds an E2 visa plus NIE.
Okay, well, we still have, in terms of coming into the United States, everybody still has to have a COVID test within 3 days prior to getting on the plane. So, which is pretty rational. Having a restriction based on your immigration status was never rational, because certain people, like a United States citizen, could come in, but someone who was trying to get a non-immigrant work visa couldn't come in. But that doesn't mean that the citizen couldn't be bringing COVID in. In terms of going into a country like Germany, I know I can't speak at this point to travel restrictions for going into other countries, but it should be easier to be able to come back. There still might be a quarantine period of 14 days, but there is no travel ban per se, where you have to show a humanitarian reason why you have to come back, or a national security reason. You just have to show you're healthy. So that makes sense, don't you think?
Great. They also had a follow-up, which you may have already answered. I'm just not familiar with the acronym. Are we allowed back in after leaving to return back into the US without an NIE?
Yes, because didn't you hear the breaking news? There are no, we don't need them anymore.
Okay, perfect. And just one last question from IODG. Sorry if I butchered your name. Does a J1 visa holder necessarily need to exit the US to change to an F1 visa, considering the new administration?
Well, the law hasn't changed for J1 visas. So if there's a restriction on your J1, the answer is yes. I mean, depending on the program, some programs have 2-year foreign residence requirements. Some don't allow you to change to certain non-immigrant statuses. So that hasn't changed. Will it change in the future? Anything's possible. But as I tell my clients, right now we live under the laws that exist. And for example, this 250-page proposed law may never pass Congress, or it may pass Congress in a way that's so mutated that that we don't know what it would look like. And I use the word mutated in the most benign sense.
Okay, all right, thank you. So we're getting close to the hour. I want to say thank you so much again for Jan for speaking with us, and also for the Rotary Club for hosting this event. And I'd like to hand it over to President Gerard to close off the session.
Gerard, you're muted.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ling. I apologize for being muted. Thank you, Jan, for alerting me on that one. I have in the past few weeks, I have been privileged to listen to a number of Zooms from various Rotary clubs around the world. And I'm very proud to say that the Zooms that we are doing from our club are really, I think, superb. And I want to thank Global Shapers particularly for their help in this. Our meetings are meat and potatoes. I mean, you know, we get right into the subject, and we deal with that subject and don't waste time on anything. And I appreciate that very much from all of our participants. You know, especially Jen, you brought up an issue tonight, you know, dealing with immigration. In my court, I deal with the government on all day long. And it's amazing to me just how nearsighted sometimes our government can be. They get caught up in bureaucratic, as you know better than I do, I'm sure, bureaucratic issues that really don't need to be there at all. And people suffer because of it. And so hopefully we'll see some change this year with immigration. You know, obviously COVID had a lot to do with it, but the whole concept that we had this punishing immigrants in the past 4 years, I mean, it just made no sense for us as a country to do that, because we suffer always when we do something like that. Keeping talent out of the country, forcing educated talent out of the country, just makes no sense. I also wanted to thank very much Lorenzo, again, for bringing, you know, some very real issues to the forefront about how COVID has involved M&A. And it's not something the average person thinks about, even as an attorney. It's not something I think about every day because I don't practice in M&A, but it's something that's very, very real. And I appreciate the time and the energy you've put into this. Thank you, Viva. Thank you, Ying. I hope we see more of you. Stay with us. My goodness. I'm thinking of something that we learned. It was a topic of discussion, I think Balor brought in early in the fall last year, of reverse mentoring. Namely, that there is so much, those of us who are older, there is so much for us to learn from you. And I try as much as I can to surround myself with young people, because the energy, the ideals, you know, the freshness is something that's very invigorating and something we all need. So I thank you very much for your talent, and I thank you very much for your contribution this evening. And I invite everyone to come back. I've been working very closely with a number of people in other Rotary clubs in the New York metropolitan area. Next month, hopefully, we will begin to start our community-based forums between trying to bridge the gap between the New York Police Department and the various communities and neighborhoods in New York City. It's something that's not been done, unfortunately, something that even people in Rotary haven't thought about, and they have now begun to think of it as something unusual and exciting. So I hope very much that all of you will join us. And I think it's something unique and something that I think should be ongoing for the next several years, not a one-shot deal, but something that whoever the president of Rotary Club of New York will be in the next few years will be, each year will continue this process. And Jan, thank you again for your time. Jan was a great president for us, and I'm glad to see he's still active.
Thank you, Judge.
And thank you everyone for being here this evening. Appreciate your time, appreciate your energy, and appreciate your thoughts. So with that, thank you so much for being with us. Andreas? Is Andreas still with us? Well, I don't know.
Absolutely, he's absolutely with us. Have a good night. Buonanotte.
I thought you were skiing somewhere, maybe up at Wyndham or Hunter or Gore Mountain or
No, not at all. I've
somewhere.
been here all the time.
All right, thank you.
I don't do night skiing, by the way.
Not a bad idea, but anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for being with us.